So I'm very excited to open this event. We really expected it, and we're happy to have this event actually happening in real life. I'm going to start by presenting the Center for Disability Studies. My name is Nili Breuer, and I'm working in the Center for Disability Studies that is leading the Israeli Academic Center for Critical Thinking on Disability, on Society and Culture. It's a partnership between the School of Social Work at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the JDC in Israel, the Joint. Before I will continue speaking more about the center, I want to make sure that everybody know the accessibility issue here. So if anybody need the closed captioning, there is a translation there in Hebrew. So I will just making sure that it's open and available, right, Oz? Okay, so I will say it also in Hebrew, so everybody can understand better if they speak in Hebrew. יש תמלול ובעצם תרגום סימולטני של האירוע הזה, יש כתוביות, הוא מלווה בכתוביות. אתם מוזמנים ומוזמנות לפתוח את ה-closed captioning, את ה-CC שנמצא בסרגל למטה. אם יש איזושהי בעיה ניתן לכתוב לנו בצ'אט, ואנחנו ניתן איזשהו מענה בצ'אט. I will continue, sorry. I just wanted to make sure that everybody that needs a closed captioning know how to find it. So our center is dedicated to promoting critical thinking regarding the social construction of disability and the marginalization, discrimination, and oppression of disabled people. We believe that promoting disability rights and justice within Israeli society is deeply rooted in understanding how social and cultural factors shape the lives of individuals with disabilities. To achieve this aim, our interdisciplinary centers strive to advance knowledge, training, research, teaching, and services in the spirit of different social models of disability, exposing them to students, professionals, policymakers, activists, and disability community members. If you are interested in learning more about our activities and taking part in future events that we are having, I invite you all to like our Facebook page. It's under the name of המרכז ללימודי מוגבלות in Hebrew. You can also subscribe to our mailing list. If you want to send us an email so we can add you, you can just find our email address in the chat below. And I will also let you know about one of our upcoming events that is going to be dedicated to the issue of hate crimes and disability. We will have Dr. Mark Sherry giving a lecture at December 1st. There will be more details on the screen with the invitation that you can read, and we will send it to our mailing list and put it on Facebook later on, so you can have the details on those media. I will return back to the accessibility if everybody join us now. So we have a simultaneous translation from English to Hebrew. It's presented as real-time transcript. You can access it by enabling the closed captioning below. It's the CC sign. And during the event, the microphone, as I said, and you probably already noticed, is going to be off except for the speakers. We will later open the microphone to people who want to ask questions or give a remark in the questions and answer in the discussion that we'll have later. people who wish to speak, please raise your hand. This is a feature of Zoom that you can sign us that you want to add something. You can also use the chat during the entire event. You can write comments, questions. Feel free also to use it to do it in Hebrew. If you want us to translate any question or comment, we will do it gladly. And I will say it also in Hebrew. מי שמעוניין או מעוניינת לשאול שאלה, להעיר הערה, אז מומלץ ורצוי לכתוב את זה בצ'אט במהלך האירוע. אין בעיה שזה רשום בעברית, אנחנו נדאג לתרגם את זה במידה ויש צורך או העדפה כזאת. I want to thank a couple of people that help this event and make sure that it will happen. So first of all, I want to thank Salome Chasnov, the director of Code of the Freak, also Carrie Sandel and Ali Patsaves, who made this event possible and helped us in all the technical matters of screening the film in Israel. It's actually a film that is not open to people outside of the US and Canada, so we were privileged enough to have this accessibility for a short time of a couple of days. Also, I want to thank Oad Cohen for translating and transcribing the event now in real time, and also the clips we'll see throughout the evening. He was the one that add this transcriptions. Also, we are a team here in the Disability Studies Center, so we all chip in and help this event happen. So I want to thank Dr. Ronnie Holler, the head of the center, also Professor Shirley Werner and Dr. Anat Greenstein, a part of our team, and our coordinator, Oz Isarov, that given me a big help here in the technical issues. So thank you, Oz, and we'll get back to you also later during the discussion. You will moderate it. So we will start by showing a short clips from the film. We added some subscription in Hebrew. יש כתוביות בעברית. We hope that it will go well. We know that on Zoom sometimes the films doesn't stream very well, but we keeping our finger crossed. And here we go. Zoom, Oz, you are invited to do it. Okay. So I think it's a great first taste from the film, showing how disabled and creeps are reacting to our imagery on films, on popular films in Hollywood, and how gender is also intersect to this imagery. I want to move on and present to our first speakers, Dr. Carrie Sandel. She's an artist and a scholar. She is the associate professor in the Department of Disability and Human Development at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's also the director of Bodies of Work. It is an organization that promotes disability arts and culture within the city of Chicago through partnership with cultural institutions and producing original work. Our own research and creative activity focus on disability and gender identities in live performance, including theater, dance, and performance art. Also joining us is Ali Patsaves, Dr. Ali Patsaves. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Disability and Human Development at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her research brings together disability studies, feminist theory, and queer theory. and focuses on the cultural politics of pain, health, and illness, as well as representation of disability in film, television, and popular culture. Both Carrie and Ali are co-producers of Code of the Freaks and also served as writers and interviewers for the film. Carrie and Ali, you will give us a presentation about the film, presenting the process, the aim of the film, and your own experience with producing it.
Great, thank you so much, Neely. And thank you to everyone who is involved in bringing this event to you all. We're really honored to be here and sharing this time with you. So Ali and I have prepared this information for you, and we're going to share in telling it. And I'm going to kick us off. A PowerPoint should be coming up in a second. The first thing, I just want to acknowledge our collaborators. This was a team effort. The film was made in collaboration with, let's see, is the PowerPoint still showing?
And back.
Now it is.
All right, thanks. With Salome Chasnoff, Susan Nussbaum, Jersey Rose. And so we worked really as a collective on this team. It was not the usual hierarchy. All right, so next slide, please. Just an overview. Ali and I are going to cover an introduction to the overall project, and then we're going to go into the concept and framework, or how we made a decision to frame the material as we did, because we had many hours of footage, and figuring out how to tell this collective story was an important part of our process. And then we want to end on a short discussion of what this film might ask us to think about in our current context. As a lot of you know, there's a lot of social unrest right now in the United States, and there are disability issues running through that unrest that I think are really speak to the concerns of our interviewees, and also the pandemic, obviously. So we're going to try to give you some of that contextualization, since if any of you wanted to show this film in the future in any context, you can see that where the film was meant to raise questions so that you could have conversations from a number of perspectives. Next slide, please. All right, so to introduce the project, first off, the project was started, might have been like 12 years ago, by Susan Nussbaum and Salome Chasnoff. Susan is a disabled playwright and novelist, and she worked at Access Living. And Access Living is a center for independent living, a disability advocacy organization in Chicago. And she decided to show a series of film clips around the topic of disability in film to fellow disabled people, people who were interfacing with the center. And it was so popular. People enjoyed so much being able to share with one another their thoughts and how these films affected their lives, that Susan decided that this would maybe be a good topic for a documentary. And she worked with Salome on some previous documentaries. And so they began this journey, and then invited me in, and Jersey and Ali. This project was connected in many ways to a large class that I teach, and Neely has taught as part of my teaching team, a class called Disability in American Film. And that's a large general education course, meaning that students from all over campus in all majors take it. And so we are trying to teach about disability issues through looking critically at the media. So the film does have a pedagogical purpose to it, for better or for ill. Some of our critics think it's too academic, but being academics, can anything be too academic? I don't think so. We had a long community research phase where we engaged with different people. We took the strategy that Susan started with of pulling together clips around a theme and then having community salons in which people could discuss them. And so we held salons that included diverse people in terms of age and race, class, different types of disabilities, in theaters, churches, community centers throughout the city of Chicago. We were trying to get a sense of what different people thought. And so we do have some early footage that documents some of those conversations. And we really were interested in how we as a community respond to representation. And that's why we wanted as much input as we have, even though we decided to do individual interviews, which I think Ali will talk about some more. We did apply for grants. We did get some funding for the film, but we ended up doing a Kickstarter campaign to complete the film. So it really was supported by a larger community, for which we are very grateful. And we ended up focusing our interviews on 13 people with disabilities who were activists, artists, and scholars. All right, I pass it on to Ali.
Thank you for the baton, Carrie. And I just want to echo the thanks to everyone who helped organize tonight's event. If we could go to the next slide. Excellent. So I'm going to pick up the conversation around sort of how we decided to organize the film, what the goal of the film is, and how that kind of shaped the choices we made. We were really looking, and I think this comes out of our academic leaning, but also in some ways this split between academic and activist conversation is also a false one, because the conversations we were wanting to have about the repetition of some of the stereotypes or the kind of dominant images we were seeing and we wanted to map are the same conversations that emerged from the salons that were coming out of kind of more community and activist spaces. But really part of our basic concept and framework was to create a condensed overview of some of these harmful, repetitive, and dominant stereotypes that are so cemented in our cultural imagination, both within Hollywood film in the US, but I think given the sort of reach of Hollywood film, these images have a much more global reach, for better, or I think we would argue worse. But in doing that, we were also really attentive to not wanting to make just a film that lists stereotypes, right? But to have a kind of larger analysis embedded in that. So part of that involved really trying to highlight the way that disability functions as a storytelling device. And for us, film just became the way for us to tell this larger story of how disability functions in this larger, storytelling process as a figure or as a kind of crux to tell stories essentially not about disabled people. And so this is another kind of key piece that we wanted to highlight as we're looking at the repetition of images about disability. It sort of became clear to us as we mapped them and smushed them together in these salons that A, these were all the same movies in some ways, and B, even though these images are cementing our ideas about disability, they're actually not about disability at all. They're about telling stories of, as Carrie says in the interviews, about life and love of non-disabled people. It's about telling stories that inspire the world and using disabled people and representations of disability to do that. But again, this wasn't sort of just the end of the story we wanted to tell. We really wanted to capture how we as a community were responding to that. And not just have this kind of didactic, here's everything that's wrong in Hollywood. Because for us, and I think this comes from the 12 years and hours and hours and hours of really thinking about the story we wanted to tell, there was so much fun in the collective conversations we were having. There was so much humor and so much survival strategies and how we interacted with these images that were really important for us to capture in the film process. And so this is partly why we really made deliberate choices to collect as many diverse voices from artists and community members and scholars to try to get some of that collective conversation, even as they're one-shot interviews. And part of how we did that was in some ways simply asking similar questions of each of our interviews, and asking them to look at some of these films back to back to back before the interview. So we were all kind of capturing some of that same conversation across the interviews to present a diverse set of voices that don't always agree. And sometimes we're in conflict with one another about what we think about these images. So just as important as capturing this overarching narrative of stereotypes was capturing how we as a community were responding to that. I think I will kick it over to Carrie next. Next slide, yes. I lied. I'm keeping the mic for another minute, sorry. So what does it mean now that we've sort of put all of this together? Yes, the film captures these persistent stereotypes, but one of the things we hope the film does is have a life beyond just the stories that we capture or just the films that you see. In some ways, because those stories haven't changed. And this was one of the kind of arguments of the film, that in doing this survey of filmmaking history, we might see some small shifts in, disability being depicted in this kind of monstrous way, more prevalently in early film, to a higher prevalence of inspiration, but narratives more recently, but they're all doing something similar. And so in some ways, we hope that the analysis that the film offers is relevant 5, 10, 15 years from now, unfortunately, because the stories in many ways remain the same. But I think the cultural conversation has changed slightly. And so as the disability activist voices have broken into a conversation about representation in ways that I think have been unprecedented, or have certainly changed in the last few years, there's a much larger cultural conversation about disabled actors playing disabled characters, and about the importance of kind of recognizing the progress that's made with disability rights legislation within the US anyway. But one of the interventions we really hope this film offers is actually a counter critique to that, and to really place this kind of cultural conversation of celebration of all of the gains against a really stagnated cultural narrative that our film seeks to capture, to raise questions about how much has actually changed for disabled people, even as we have these kind of beginnings of shifts in cultural conversation. I'm gonna now turn it to Carrie.
Thanks, Sally. I want to talk a little bit more about the situation of disabled actors, because that is one of my primary research interests, and also my own training as someone who has training in theater. As Ali mentioned, disability activist voices right now are getting a lot of attention. I don't know about what your Facebook feeds might look like, or if you're on Facebook or looking in the newspaper, there are a lot of calls for hiring disabled actors for disabled roles. And I think that one of the things we want to emphasize is when we go for authenticity, if that's, people are calling this quote unquote authentic casting. But when we go for authenticity, what are the dangers in doing so? So if you have a story that is unchanged, if you have a narrative that is really not about disability, if you put actual disabled actors in those roles, then is there a possibility that people will think that the disability community has endorsed that representation? So as we are getting more disabled actors, we need more stories. Things will not change until we change these narrative patterns. Right now, too, these types of stories are really intersecting with incidents of and systemic racism and ableism. And those very clearly highlight these stories of progress. This year was the 30th anniversary celebration of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's been 30 years, but we have not seen that much progress in terms of disabled people getting into positions where they are the filmmakers. Also in the US, many of the incidents of shootings of Black men tend to be men with disabilities. So people and women, mental health issues, deafness, autistic, and that people aren't, at least in the United States, talking as much about that intersection as we should be. This is that race and disability and gender, the issues that we raise in the film are all intertwined, and that we can't really address one without addressing the other. So we're hoping that some of the intersectional issues that we were able to raise in the film, there were many more, but focused on some, will help further those conversations or raise questions. Also during the time of COVID, what we're seeing in the United States, especially now that we're in a third wave, I mean, a lot of the news in Chicago where we live, they just instituted more shutdowns and rolling back some of the openness that we had. But there are hospitals now reaching capacity. And earlier when hospitals were reaching capacity, there was a lot of discussion about who would be prioritized during the time when hospitals have to make choices or have to triage who they're going to treat. And in some of the documents that hospitals were putting out, or ethics boards, people with disabilities, older people, were not given priority, or that were lower on the list of lives that were considered worth saving. And probably the worst incidence of this is for people who use ventilators themselves all the time at home, for instance. The way the US insurance system works is that those really don't belong to the person who is using them. So usually it's a medical supply company that the insurance rents the equipment from and gives to the person who uses the ventilator. So people who are using ventilators, if they needed to go to the hospital and were in an emergency room, those ventilators could be taken away from that disabled person to give to somebody else. And that was justified under some of these medical triages. So the issues that the film raises about assumptions of whose lives are worth living is so present right now, and so frightening for all of us in the disability community. And so there are many ways that these narratives, they're not just about movies. They inform how people understand the value in the lives of people with disabilities, how we even understand ourselves. So Ali, did you want to add anything before we turn it back over to Neely?
I think I would just echo this kind of last point that, you know, in making a film about Hollywood film, I think there's an easy critique to sort of say like, okay, who watches films anymore anyway? It's all about TV serials. They're more interesting anyway. Or why do you spend time on outlining this sort of dominant representations of disability in Hollywood when there's so many more urgent issues facing people with disabilities? And I think it was important for us to say that these things are not disconnected, that in mapping the kind of cure and kill impulse that you see in the films that we track, this is deeply connected to this larger cultural sentiment that says, yeah, disabled people have no future, they have no lives, their lives are not worth living. And that makes possible some of the like more real and immediate experiences that are threatening disabled people's lives right now. And so, not to sort of start us off with the sort of weight of this, but I think, you know, one of the tasks that we as a kind of creative team had was to how to map this out, how to capture the humor, capture the criticism and the community and the critique, while still actually talking about things that are really about, for many people, about life and death, right? In our community. And so, you know, I think maybe the open question is whether we've managed to capture that balance or not, but in kind of presenting what we were hoping the film did was really kind of capture both of those things. And I think I will end there. Hand it back to Neely.
Everybody hates you.
Thank you, Ali and Cherry. And I think that also this last clip is really connected in a good way to what you spoke about. In one hand, we have like huge split between real life and the imagery on screen about disabled people. But on the other hand, there is a real impact of the image, of stereotypes, of the plot line and the way that it's usually ended for disabled character, and how it's affect the way we appreciate or in our society usually disvalue disabled people and their life. Also, thanks for connecting it to the COVID, to the coronavirus. In Israel, we had something similar to what you spoke about in creating a priority between non-disabled and disabled people who will receive treatment if there will not be enough staff or ventilation machine to give to the one who needs it. So it's connected again to the stereotypes and the image we're receiving in popular culture. I want to go on and to present our third speaker. Dr. Slava Greenberg is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Southern California, Kasten Institute and School of Cinematic Arts. His research explores the potential of mainstream and emerging media forms to offer transformative experiences in reference to disability studies, trans studies, and gender. Slava will present his comment to the Code for the Freaks. So Slava, you are invited to present your comment.
Thank you, Nili, and everyone. I want to comment on the film and put it into context within film theory and put it in where I think it fits generically in terms of what I call shaming Hollywood documentaries. So since the 1980s, there have been dozens of films contesting Hollywood's alignment of its protagonists and overall heroism with whiteness, masculinity, straightness, cisgenderness, and able-bodiedness. It's for 4 decades now, documentaries presenting talking heads of activists, filmmakers, actors, archivists, and scholars juxtaposed with clips of stereotypical representations of anyone who did not fit the unmarked norm. So because of the real life urgency of the social issues of all these documentaries, what they set out to amend, they sort of resemble essays or indictments against the oppressor of their accomplices more than movies, like Carrie already mentioned, one of the main critiques of all these films. So during the 1980s, films like Black Hollywood and Ethnic Notions explored the role of Black actors, directors, and audience members in the US and investigated the deep-rooted stereotypes which fueled anti-Black prejudice. In the 1990s and 2000s, films like The Celluloid Closet and Fabulous, the story of a queer cinema, surveyed various Hollywood screen depictions of gays and lesbians and the attitudes behind them in a chronological look, looking at films from 1947 to 2005. During the 2000s, other non-white and people of color have joined the documented protests against Hollywood. For example, Real Bad Arabs that explored the long line of degrading images of Arabs, The Slanted Screen, and Hollywood Chinese that focused on the depiction of Asian American male characters from Hollywood films and the history through the lens of Chinese American experience. In 2009, Real in June was released, exploring the history of the depiction of Native Americans in Hollywood films. And it wasn't until 2014 that the feminist version was released under the title Real Her Story, the Real Story of Real Women, Real EE. The documentary corrects the historic notion that women behind the scenes in motion pictures held peripheral careers. So all these films throughout these 4 decades have tried to use documentary as a form of trial. Through these documentaries, the offended group makes its case by confronting viewers and demanding accountability. Essentially, these documentaries set out to shame Hollywood for its criminal offense against the majority of its spectators. Each one of these documentaries drafts an indictment, presenting convincing arguments and proofs, compelling archival evidence, reliable expert witnesses, and most importantly, testimonies of the crime's victims. Because the documentaries lack the judicial authority of a verdict, they're left with shaming the producers and consumers of the offensive images. However, just the case is, through this perspective, the imagined or desired spectators of these films are jury members and judges, or suspects, defendants, and perpetrators. Where are the films that speak to the community members and allies? So I'm getting to 2020, and 2 of the most recent Shaming Hollywood documentaries released this year are Disclosure, that looks at the depiction of trans people, and Code of the Freaks, the portrayal of people with disability. Both these films have altered this perspective by imagining their own community members as possible viewers. In an account of making Code of the Freaks, elegantly titled "It's All the Same Movie," Carrie Sandel emphasizes the ways in which disabled spectators were brought under account in the production of the film. And I'm gonna quote Carrie. Our interviewees not only school the audience on their own perspectives and experiences of the movies, they also include detail that speaks directly to other disabled people by using cultural references and insider language, which is often politically incorrect. Unlike Hollywood, then, we assume our general audience includes people with disabilities, end quote. This new addition is what the Shaming Hollywood documentaries lacked all along. As a trans spectator, when I began watching Disclosure, I thought it was just another one of those documentaries that wasn't really meant for me. It took over a third of the film and the accumulation of testimonies countering, opposing, and objecting these violent images for me to realize they weren't just schooling cis viewers, but addressing me directly. This renewed sense of safety is the direct result of testimonies of somewhat diverse trans talking heads, not only responding to the clips, but also co-contextualizing them, resisting their original use. They manifest a visual and verbal opposition. Both Disclosure and Code of the Freaks give trans and disabled viewers the opportunity to experience the pleasure of being represented, joining in communal spectatorship, even traveling in time. Although each interviewee sits alone in a room, they're often edited as if they were a group. Several may respond to the same scene, film, or series, thus offering a sense of collective spectatorship. Disclosure and Code of the Freaks offer a sense of communal spectatorship rather than an indictment. While they could be perceived as educational films for cis and non-disabled viewers, their greater significance lies in the potential to offer trans and disabled spectators an experience of communal spectatorship. As the Shaming Hollywood documentary genre exposes, if you're not white, masculine, cis, straight, able-bodied, you've been consuming degrading images of yourself, and you were probably watching them alone. The talking heads in both Code of the Freaks and Disclosure transform into fellow audience members, talking back to the screen with you. We are offered the unique experience of opposing and applauding representations of our communities together. In this streaming era, intensified during our current quarantine reality of home viewing, both films offer a glimpse into what communal or collective spectatorship may mean for those who have little or no access to it. Despite Disclosure and Code of the Freaks' similarities in imagining their own communities as possible spectators, Code of the Freaks offers an additional insight into the representational logic missing from the Shaming Hollywood genre. It wasn't until the third year of teaching film and disability that I've learned the lesson at the heart of Code of the Freaks' circular structure. Code of the Freaks uses Todd Browning's Freaks from 1932, both as a prologue and an epilogue. In the beginning, it uses the film to argue it was the worst of times in representation, and it ends using it to imply that it may have been the best of times for disabled actors. Teaching the Farrelly brothers' films, I was trying to make the case of improvement from films like Dumb and Dumber and Me, Myself, and Irene to films like There's Something About Mary and Stuck on You. The same week of that session, Dumb and Dumber 2 was released, 20 years after the first. And for me, set them back to square one. One of Code of the Freaks' most effective tools lies in this circular narrative, showing that change is never linear or chronological, and improvement or intersectionality in some contemporary films does not necessarily mean progress. The Farrelly brothers' films, like Todd Browning at that time employ more disabled actors than any contemporary Hollywood director. At the same time, their films, like Freaks, contains degrading representations of people with disability alongside some of the most daring and subversive ones. Code of the Freaks reminds us that change isn't linear, but also allows us to watch together, because even the same movie isn't the same when you watch it with your own community. Thank you.
Thank you, Slava. Thank you so much for this important comment and putting the spot on the importance of community and having our own view and discourse and humor, as Ali said earlier, about our representation in popular culture. We want to show another clips. It's the end of the film, and then later we will move on. It's a great ending of the film, and I really like the last quote of getting more power for disabled people, so we can change the representation on screen. This is a good time to open our event for the discussion. Anybody want to ask a question or give a comment to one of the speakers is invited to write it on the chat and or to just raise the hand. Raised hand is in the feature of the Zoom, and we will open their mic. Oz will, I'm moving it to you, the moderating of this discussion, and you can start saying who will ask the question first.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go by the order of the questions that were asked on the chat. So I hope and then I'll get to the people that raised their hands now. I'll say it in Hebrew as well. תזכורת שכל מי שרוצה או רוצה לשאול שאלה, אפשר לכתוב את זה גם בעברית, ואנחנו נתרגם לאנגלית. So the first question was by Yotam, and he asked do you see any connection points between post-humanism and disability studies? Carrie or Allison?
Just so I heard it, between post-humanism and disability studies. Yeah, I have to admit that I'm not sort of fully versed in this literature, but I know other folks within disability studies certainly are. I mean, I think I don't know, Carrie, if you feel more grounded to speak to this. I think there's some kind of interesting work within, at least in the context of representation, some interesting work in the sort of genres of science fiction that are tapping into this kind of literature and trying to imagine forms of humanity outside of the human and outside of sort of even human bodies. And I think that there's potential there. I mean, I'm a fan of science fiction, I think, but I know this isn't exactly the same as this literature, but it's my way, and so forgive me for elisions here. But I think there's also a danger precisely because much of these representations do precisely that. They allied the body and they allied sort of the aspects of kind of the specificities of disability experiences that get kind of written out in this turn toward some sort of futurity and post-humanness that I think tends to serve as a shorthand solution to the problem of disability, in narratives anyway.
Yeah, I just would be remiss if I didn't say that this is one of Neely's areas of expertise. So if I'm quoting Neely, it's because my thinking has been really influenced by her on this topic. One of the things that I'm thinking about with transhumanism and the science fiction representations that tend to portray technology as a way to transcend disability or become even better than normal people, quote unquote, is that it again shifts the focus from actual people with disabilities. And that's been our critique of these movies, is that while they purport to be about us, they're not really. And so again, there's just so much richness in our actual lives that could be mined for new narratives that I think, you know, I think there's a lot of potential in those representations, but I just want more of more complex representations that don't present disability as something to overcome. And often those transhumanist narratives become overcoming stories that think about disability as something else that goes away. So in those narratives, disability goes away because it points to a time in which the disability doesn't matter because you're even better than normal.
Thank you very much. Sola asked if you can please talk a little bit why you chose the title Code of the Creeps.
Yeah, so it's a direct reference to the film Freaks. As in the film Freaks, there's a group of circus performers and sideshow performers, and one of them is being taken advantage of and financially, and also there's a plot to murder this little person by one of the non-disabled performers. And so the group of performers bands together to get their revenge on the so-called normal people. So it's a tongue-in-cheek for us, and again, it's that kind of inside joke where the ringmaster or Barker, Carnival Barker, in the actual film Freaks, says that if you hurt one disabled person, then you just better be careful because they'll come and get you. He says, if you offend one, you offend them all. So we were trying to get that sense of collective spectatorship that Slava was talking about. And also it's sort of our way to fight back. You saw the clips at the end from the movie where they're like crawling through the mud with their knives in their teeth and, you know, looking menacing. It's just, it's a hyperbole. It's an exaggeration of kind of a counter fantasy of revenge. Ali, did you want to add something?
I can't add to that. That was perfect. Thank you.
And it's also kind of like cracking a code, because once we figured out that it didn't matter what the ending of the movie was, that it's basically the same movie, then we're hoping that others could use it as a code, like, oh, okay, this is heading down the road to teach non-disabled people to be better people, and there's so much more that we could be talking about.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna let Gilly Hammer ask the question she asked on the chat.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's good to see friends and colleagues, and thank you, Ali and Carrie. It was fascinating to hear the behind the scenes and context. I think it's a great movie and a great pedagogical tool. I wanted to ask about intersectionality. So in the movie, you touched upon race and masculinity, for example, which was very interesting. And I was wondering if there were other intersections that you wanted to touch upon or were thinking about. And also just, it's an American context. So I was wondering if you could imagine how this type of film would look in another context or another country. And the other question was about the way you used interviews and salons, which I think is really interesting because it's this connection between film studies and more sociological or anthropological methods, which is a very nice interdisciplinary approach to make and the product is eventually a film. It was very interesting that you also used other methods when you, so I really liked, Ali, what you said before about coming from above and coming from bottom-up approach, and how it's a negotiation of the stereotypes and not only about the stereotypes. So if you can say a little bit more about that. And the last question, I don't know if you have time for everything, but I was wondering about parallels between disability in films and disability in other arts, and whether you think there is a fundamental maybe difference between film and performing arts, because in disability dance, for example, there have been major changes in how disability is depicted on stage. So I was also wondering about that. Thank you.
Okay, those are all great questions. Ali, was there one you wanted to pick up on since I answered the last one?
Maybe I'll start the conversation about other kind of intersectional analyses, and then I'll kick it to you, Carrie. I think, one that we really, or I anyway, really kind of wanted to explore was this intersection of intellectual disability and class, the kind of depiction of people with intellectual disabilities, as sort of always inevitably quote unquote poor, and right, and some of the harm that is done with those depictions. And I think this was a really an important learning opportunity for me, because I think one of the decisions about not doing that in the film was about who we are as filmmakers, whose voices we are speaking from and not for, and also not wanting to reproduce the harm in the images that we were sort of setting up and showing in repeat. And so we had this sort of collection of representations of people with intellectual disabilities as having bad teeth. And this is a sort of repeated trope in how people with intellectual disabilities and cartoons that were coded as intellectually disabled were depicted. But part of that, and I think there's an important kind of analysis there, but for the medium of film, that showing that and unpacking that on film, we felt did more harm than it did illuminate. And so, part of that negotiation over what we're choosing to focus on and what not was about mitigating that or balancing that. I don't know, Carrie, if you want to.
Yeah, that's a really great example. We
either
really
pick up on that or another point of question.
Yeah, that was a very instructive conversation we had, because there was almost no way to do that. Well, there was no way. We couldn't find a way to make sure that the critique would balance out the harm, because when you put a montage together of this imagery, our montages were meant to make people laugh, even when they were really awful. Even when the depictions were really depressing, we made funny juxtapositions, but it was not okay to do that with the other images. So that was something else that we thought about. And something that's absent from the film, so there were absent intersections that we found also interesting, is that the section on African-American men and disability was pretty easy to document and to explore. And there was a scholar, John Nickel, who had written an article that sent us down this path in the first place. But we were like, well, where are the representations of disabled women of color? And we searched and searched, and there really weren't any, unless you're talking about images of African-American women as having substance use issues or mental health issues, but they weren't presented as disability issues in the movies. They were kind of buried. So that was interesting too. Where are the Asian American disabled characters? Where are the Native American disabled characters? Where are the Latinx disabled characters? It was just in their absence, it spoke volumes. And that was something that was really interesting, that search for really just exposed how limited Hollywood is. So you asked about how the film might resonate differently in different countries. I think that's what we would like to learn from you all, because the kind of story that Hollywood tells is a very American story. It's an American myth. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. If you are strong enough, you can overcome anything. If you choose to end your life with assisted suicide, it's because you've made a heroic choice. It's an American myth that is deeply damaging. And as Ali said at the beginning, it's been exported all over the world, but I'm not sure exactly how other people in other countries are perceiving it. I do know that there's interesting independent films coming from around the world that are far more interesting, especially international independent films, so much more interesting work. And I think that those would, if you especially were teaching this material, finding those films and showing them as a counterexample would be really instructive. And then in speaking of instructive, Gili asked about dance, and I would say that Gili's own work is on the topic of disability and dance, and she's far more of an expert than I, but I have been writing about disability and dance, and I actually turned to dance for inspiration about how to get out of this really constricting narrative, because so much work is interesting going on in disability and dance because it centers new forms from disabled bodies' experiences. So whenever disabled bodies enter the dance stage or the dance arena, the form of dance automatically changes. So if you are a ballet dancer and you use a wheelchair, that changes ballet. That's not an analogy in film. You can put disabled people in the film and it doesn't change the film. So dance, I think, has much greater capacity to invent alternatives, because if you wanted to do that kind of inventive change from a disability perspective, you have to change the format of film, and Hollywood is just not there. There's some very interesting independent films or even social media type representations that are doing this, but not Hollywood. Hollywood would really have to open up what they consider a Hollywood narrative. I think we almost got, did we get all of them? I made a list. I feel like we did.
Neely, do you want to take the next question?
Sure. Thanks, Yoaz. I wanted to talk about community and the limits of the community. We're speaking about people with disability, disabled people, as a group that we thinking on as part of a significant part of the audience of this film. But I'm wondering, also connecting it to Slava, if people with disability that not consider themselves as part of the community will experience the same feeling of the same way of understanding the message of the film, being part of the criticism that activists raise, because the position of activists, disabled activists and people with disability are not necessarily the same. So I'm wondering what is the impact of this film on people that are on the margin of our community, or not necessarily see themselves as even part of it.
Yeah, thank you.
To the three of you.
Slava, do you want to?
Well, I think that's the beauty of the film, because it will force them into a community. It could be unwillingly, but I'm sure there will be some part throughout the film in which they might feel represented. It could be a scene, it can be a sentence, it could be a sort of like even a facial expression when someone is asked about these films. It could be just a small glimpse of where they're reflected some sort of an emotion that once arose while they were watching, and that moment of having somebody else sort of metaphorically sit there with them and talk back to that scene, and you know, maybe articulate a thought that they had. I think that is something that is essentially what a community gives all of us. It's not just a sense of belonging, but that someone's got our back, and you know, we're in this together, and sort of we're fighting against that together. So I think it could happen even unintentionally.
I would also hope that this would be an invitation to people who don't know about disability community to maybe seek it out online or through resources in their community. But you're absolutely right that not everybody has access to disability culture or community, and some people actively do not want to associate. But perhaps even knowing some of the terms of the debate is helpful in someone situating themselves in relation to some of this imagery. Ali, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think, you know, one of the things we really consciously tried to do was also show that even amongst the critique, there's not consensus. And that, I think, is hopefully part of the invitation in to the conversation for people that, you know, not everybody in the disability community hates everything. I mean, I think Carrie, Susan, and I sort of represent like a pretty, like, you know, 12 years of looking at this material, and we're just like, no, we hate it all, everything, which is also not true. Like, there are moments of things we like, but also, like, there are stories that people are really attached to and that are really important to them and have done a lot of work that I think, or we hope, brings people in different ways and shows that, you know, the community isn't sort of monolithic either.
Thank you very much. Elon, I'm gonna unmute you.
Yes, okay. First of all, thank you, Ali and Carrie and Slava for this talk. It's been enlightening. My question was, have you seen the movie, The Fundamentals of Caring? And if you have, what are your thoughts about it? And also, your movie is sort of like a list of what not to do in films, and I would like to hear your opinion. How would you like to see disability portrayed in movies? And one extra thought that I had after asking the question is that I believe that many of these actors in these movies are acting in good intention, and part of the decision to portray these characters comes from kind of being misinformed about disability, and by educating them more about what it means to live with a disability, maybe they could choose better scripts. So another thought that I had. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I haven't seen the Fundamentals of Caring. I think I went on you know, after we made the film, I was like, I can't, I need some time away from things that have come out recently. So, you know, that might be part of it. but I certainly do hope that our film, by mapping out what has been done, gives a sort of roadmap for what not to do. But I'm going to kind of balk a little bit at the what is there, what we want to see, because I think for me, like, what I want to see is what's not imaginable yet. Like, this is what, for me, I feel like I don't know what I want to see because I haven't seen it yet. And that to me is what I want. Like, I want to be surprised with the story. I want to see, and that there are stories, certainly, like wonderful narratives and wonderful independent films, but I'm also kind of holding my breath a little bit for something that surprises me or does something different or new. And what's most exciting for me is not knowing what that looks like. And I kind of want to keep that unimaginable horizon as the possibility.
I love that, Ali. I think, and we really also hope that people who are coming into the arts, or younger people, can use their insights and their enthusiasm and their unjadedness to bring some change. I saw in the chat off the corner of my eye a question about pain and suffering and representing pain and suffering. And so that was sitting in my mind as this question was asked. And I think that I was thinking, well, I also have chronic pain, and I was thinking, well, how could that be portrayed as more complexly than just suffering? Because certainly suffering is part of having chronic pain, but also I live my life as a person with chronic pain. I experience joy, I experience pleasure, I'm a parent, I'm a teacher, and everything, though, all of those roles are affected by my chronic pain. I see them through my experiences of pain, but I don't ever see that anywhere portrayed. I don't see pain as anything other than something to get rid of. So what is it? I want to see more about what would it mean if the way we are in our bodies informed the narrative rather than getting rid of it is the narrative. Does that make sense? I'm hoping for something like that.
I'm looking for films that people with disabilities are characters, and they're in action films and in horror films, and they play different, and they're the villains and the protagonists, and the disability is not necessarily what the film is about, for it not to be the main issue, the same as with a trans person, for them to just be a person in a narrative, committing crime, doing whatever, plotting something, investigating something, and without the whole, like, this aspect of their identity being the whole story and everything that the narrative is based on. Or like the part where the thing that I like about the Farrelly brothers is the fact that they allow people with disabilities being jerks, which is also something that we lack in film.
Thank you very much, Neely.
Yes. Wow. I know that we have more questions, and I definitely have more, but we need to end. So I want to thank all our guests, Carrie, Ali, Slava. Thank you so much for joining us for this event and enable us to see the film and learn more about I want to thank everybody that joined us today and take part of the event. Again, thank you for our translator, Oad Cohen, who did a great job in making it more accessible to Hebrew speakers. We will hear everybody that want to join our Facebook page or our mailing list. I remind you that you can approach us by email or finding us on Facebook. And looking forward to see you again in our next event. Thank you so much and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you, Carrie, Ali, and Slava.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.